Good afternoon, everybody. I welcome you all to another edition of Wednesday lecture series. So this week, we are going to take a look at modernism. Now, modernism as a social concept, modernism as a literary concept, modernism again as a thought or idea, and how this thought or idea pervaded hundreds of years. We'll take a look at this. In fact, the word modernism means different things to different people or different things to different cultures. In fact, anything that is transgressive, your behavior, your thought, your idea came to be known as modern. So some people use the term modern to refer to even the 5th century. That was the fall of the Roman Empire, the pagan Roman Empire. In its place came the Eastern Roman Empire, a Christian empire, and many people say we could safely call this a period of modernism. Then some people say it was the beginning of Renaissance or the end of the Middle Ages or the medieval age, where a new paradigm shift took place. Our concept of the whole world changed from the Ptolemaic worldview. We had this Copernican worldview where people believed that Earth was no longer the center of the universe. It was the sun, which was the center of our solar system, and Earth is one among the 9 planets. Ideas change. Some people call that Renaissance in culture and art that took place, or even in religion, Reformation in religion that took place in the 16th century, as responsible for modernist thought. People call what Martin Luther's idea of church and faith, it was regarded as a modernist thought. Later, people like Isaac Newton and others came, and the worldview completely changed. So, for some people, it's an international movement that began somewhere during the later part of the 19th century, and it erupted in different countries and in different times, and any break from the historical thought, any break from the traditional thought came to be regarded as modern. If you look at the history of English literature, people call the period beginning from 1500 as early modern, then the 20th century as late modern. And now you have to remember, literary modernism is something distinct or something unique. I don't have any definition to offer, but we'll take a look at some of the important aspects of modernism, beginning from the 1870s, which lasted till the end of the Second World War. That was 1945. So, for a long time, people thought it was a complete break from history and moving away from historical consciousness into something else, that is consciousness of the present, which could be called modern. Okay, so I have a few slides to show you. So I'll show some of those slides so that you can understand. Okay, so now Modernism, for some people, it was all about the arrival of machines in the 20th century, beginning from what we call the Edwardian era, end of Victorian era in 1901, and the Edwardian era and the Georgian era that followed. For many people thought it was a period of modernism or modernist views or what we call modernity. Right. Now, look at this. The whole concept of modernism underwent change, and we do not have a proper definition for modernism. So, modernism is not a term to which you can ascribe a single meaning. It can be applied both to the content and the form of a work. But remember, it opened a whole new vista of human possibilities. So, you have to remember this fact that modernism is marked by experimentation and particularly manipulation of form. And also, it teaches us a final point, that is, knowledge is not something absolute. Okay, so you have to bear it in mind, knowledge is not something absolute that keeps changing, and there is a way of controlling human thought, and there is a way of manipulating form, and so on. Okay, we'll look at modernism and what it means to different people. So, for instance, the beginning of 20th century also meant the arrival of technology or the arrival of machines. There was, in the 19th century, you had something like a railway, something like a telegraph, or even an engineering marvel like Suez Canal, right? Something that connects the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. And many things happened during the last part of the 19th century. In literature, we call that the turn of the century, or even sometimes people use the term decadence, and arrival of art for art's sake movement. Right. So that was the end of 20th century. Now, beginning of 20th century also saw the arrival of many forms of technology. So when I say the arrival of many forms of technology, you need to understand technology permeated our way of life. Technology not only became part of our human life, but it could be seen visibly. For example, the motor car. It was on the roads. So people were using motor cars, and you can see that cinematography, for instance, what we call cinematography or moving camera, they were used on a large scale. Machine gun was used for the first time during the First World War. And you know, Alfred Nobel, the man who was responsible for TNT, trinitropyrimidine, and he was responsible for giving to the world a really explosive matter. Okay, then you look at the field of medicine, and large-scale vaccination was taken all over the world. People like Louis Pasteur and others, they introduced what we call vaccination. For the first time, BCG was used. We know all that. Then remember, during the beginning of the 20th century, we come across what we call the industrial development. So smokestack industries were built all over the globe. Smoke spewing industries were built all over the countries. So as a result, what happened? You come across your new way of life. Electricity was used on a large scale. New cities were designed, And for example, a man like Corbusier, he came up with something like radial cities. So you have a central business district, and from there, in a concentric fashion, the cities develop. So you have this whole concept of radial cities, and huge pylons were erected to conduct heavy-duty electricity from one part of the world to another part of the world, and sometimes from one part of the country to another part of the country. And people call this modernism. Why? It talks about a new way of life, a new way of thinking, and you have a total break from the past. So when we talk of total break from the past, um, that is a complete revamp of our thinking. So, and you can see that there was a loss of sense of tradition. So there was this extreme form of reactionary form of life, and it celebrated this new form of life as a means of liberation from the past, and it reflected in every sphere of our life, including our socio-cultural sphere and even in our literary writing. Now, there are many strands of modernism. One, take a look at this. When F.T. Marinetti, an Italian, when he published his Futurist Manifesto, uh, he was talking about the future, not about the present or the past, but he was talking about the future, how the world would be like 50 years from now, or so on. Now, he had a futuristic thought and a futuristic vision, and what he communicated in the manifestos and in his frequent lectures and even readings, uh, they were very simple. That is, rejection of conventional morality and traditional views, including poetic values, which he thought as something timid, nostalgic, and sentimental. He was of the firm view that we had to turn our back on all these traditional views and values of the past. So, now, according to him, it was this turning away from the 19th century romantic interest in nature and toward a 20th century, and which would be based on, that is, our life would be based on technology, speed, and city or urban life. He could foresee megacities, arrival of metropolitan mindset and metropolitan cities. So, in his work, he's substituted the image of the modern racing car for the classical winged symbol of poetry, that is Pegasus. And he made it very clear that his intent was not to kill poetry, but make it or remake it and make it suitable for modern times. Right. There are certain typical thematic features uh, pertaining to modernist thinking. One is intentional distortion of shapes. So now keep this in mind. Intentional distortion of shapes. That is, you break free from your traditional way of thinking, what we understand as the world, what we understand as home, or what we understand as an industrial spot. From all this, we need to take a complete break, and that is why there is an internal or rather intentional distortion of shapes. The focus was on form rather than meaning. I will elaborate on that, on this. That is, um, That is, it doesn't matter what your text conveys, what kind of meaning it conveys, because meaning is something subject to interpretation. And the importance is given, or rather was given, to form. And also, it was this breaking down of limitations of space and time. I'll tell you more about this a little later. But significant point was this breakdown of social norms and cultural values. Many new movements emerged, and the arrival of ideologies during the beginning of 20th century, it disturbed the human mind and temporarily dislocated the traditional way of thinking. Right, dislocation of meaning and sense from its normal context. Okay, so just move a few things down. Rejection of history and a substitution of a mythical past. So history was looked at with, or rather looked at with some kind of suspicion. All these true claims of history were looked at with suspicion, and history was rejected as something, as a record of the lives of people whom we call belong to a higher culture. In its place came substitution of a mythical past, and it happened over a period of time. I'll tell you more about mythical writing or mythical pattern in writing, which T.S. Eliot and others resorted to. Then, while the focus is on the present, that is the complexity of modern urban life. See, for instance, we had a group of poets called Pylon poets. This was a distinct group of people who celebrated modern life. Pylon is nothing but the post you see, which is used, which is almost pyramidal in its structure, which is used to convey electricity or from one place to another, especially high voltage electricity from one place to another. Then the next important thing is the importance of the unconscious mind. Now, I want to tell you two people who really influenced this kind of thinking. One was the arrival of Sigmund Freud on the medical scene as well as on the literary scene. So, his concept of human mind and his concept of the unconscious and the conscious, right? And also the concept of phenomenology promoted by Edmund Husserl, how human consciousness is very important, and our consciousness is something always focused on something. Okay, then there was this widespread interest in the primitive and non-Western cultures. People traveled all over the globe. They went and made great studies of people in the South Pacific Islands and in South America, in the deep jungles of Amazon, and also the large-scale excavations that took place in Egypt and in India by the archaeological department. And it brought to light the life that was once lived, the former civilizations, the civilizations that once existed. Now, all this completely altered the Western view of the world. So, there was this distinction between the people of the Occident and people of the Orient. The Western countries as something distinct and the Eastern countries having distinct civilization. Later they discovered all these cultures were not uniformly the same. There were so many differences in the cultural practices. So, and they had to contend with this problem of absolute interpretation of reality. What is the real? or what we presume to be real, or what we perceive to be real, how our mind or our consciousness perceives reality. Now, added to this was an overwhelming technological changes. Technological changes around one's own life, inside their homes, outside their homes, on the streets, and the world in general. Okay, so there were other influential thinkers who lived during that time, and um, look at this paper. Just I want to show you, people. We are not going to look into their work, but look at quantum theory or Max Planck's quantum theory in 1900, and Albert Einstein's theory of relativity. Then a philosopher like Nietzsche, who wrote this popular work, Will of Power, and Henry Bergson on the concept of time, and a great psychologist like William James, who wrote on emotions and inner time, and of course Freud, who wrote on the unconscious, especially the interpretation of dreams. So how things that are suppressed in our unconscious have a way of manifesting themselves in our dreams. Then Carl Jung and his concept of collective unconscious. Then there was this linguistic study undertaken by Ferdinand de Saussure, and how there was this linguistic term and the study of language, how it altered our whole concept of language. Then people like Fraser, anthropologists like Fraser, who made a study on primitive cultures. Okay, so now apart from these influential thinkers, there were ideologies which were very popular, saying the whole world was under colonialism. That is, um, uh, people say 4 parts of the world, right? Right, out of 5 parts, right? 4/5 of the world was under colonial oppression. The Western countries had complete dominance over nations on earth, and colonialism, which was nothing but an imperial project, was in place. See, according to Ashish Nandi, colonialism was nothing but an armed, he calls that, he makes an interesting phrase, he calls it the armed suppression of the world, and this was also a modernist project where technology was used on a large scale to suppress people. Whoever had access to men, material, and weaponry, they were able to conquer the world and control the world. Okay, so we all know capitalism was on a spree. Okay, so surplus capital was invested elsewhere in another part of the world, and there was this free flow of goods from one part of the world to another, and not only raw goods, even manufactured goods, they had a way of coming back, and a capitalist form of economy in the guise of international trade survived, and in the form of international trade had complete control over the world's economy. Now, socialism as a thought had its roots in the 19th century, writings of people like Karl Marx, Engels, and others, which finally took a shape in the form of political form of socialism, that was communism. In 1917, Russia became the first communist nation on earth. It was a violent transfer from the old order of things to a new order, to a communist order of governance. Okay, the 20th century that was the first part of 20th century, also belonged to other ideologies like Nazism. Now, Nazism was a German socialist thinking. Well, when the Nazis, when they came to power, they tried to implement Nazism, and Hitler made use of every opportunity to impose his Nazi thoughts on his people. Now, fascism, this is an interesting thought or ideology which considered the leader as the supreme, and such leaders were born in certain historical contexts, and people had to place their blind faith in such leaders, and they had to obey blindly these political leaders. Okay, it had its roots in Mussolini's Italy, and later in Spain and other places. The whole concept of fascism spread. Okay, now pacifism, promoted by Mahatma Gandhi, somehow or other disappeared in this violent assertion of ideologies. Nationalism, yes, in countries like India, Nigeria, wherever colonialism was practiced, nationalism was a nascent thought during the beginning of the 20th century. This is all about self-determination and self-governance, and this thought was slowly taking roots in the minds of people. And modernism was also about a world, a consumerist world, because of manufactured goods. They had to be sold in capitalist markets, and people came to have a consumerist set of mind. Now, what does it exactly mean, a consumerist set of mind? That is, you buy consumerist goods and you make use of them, right? So, throughout the 20th century, the whole concept of consumerism became very, very popular. Now, remember, see, Peter Berger, in his theory of the avant-garde, you must have come across this term avant-garde, that is, in the vanguard or in the forefront. So, Peter Berger, he convincingly argues that avant-gardism was to dismantle the institutional autonomy of art. Okay, ideology was for our mind and our socio-political and economic governance. Then there was something like art, the world of art and culture. So now Peter Berger says, when this avant-garde sensibility took roots in the minds of people, there was a conscious effort to erase the frontiers between culture and political society, and there was this return to aesthetic production and returning of aesthetic production to its humble and privileged place within social practices as a whole. Now, what does he mean by that? That is aesthetic production. There is something called aesthetic modernity, right? We talk about cultural modernity. In the same breath, we have to admit the concept of aesthetic modernity. Okay, so I'll talk more about these ideologies and other forms of thought that completely altered our perception of the present and took a break from history, and how it tried to erase historical consciousness into something like a present moment consciousness. Okay. During this time, what we call period of modernism, there are many interesting movements, cultural movements. Now remember, art and life, they interbreed. We cannot separate art completely from life or life completely from art. So remember, modernism as a concept has resurfaced, right? Time and again in history. But remember, history and modernity, they play something like a cat and mouse game. Say, um, now history and modernity, they occupy different ontological sites. History belongs to the past, whereas modernity that belongs to the present. Now, Nietzsche, he famously introduced this concept of active forgetting. That is, and he says this is a healthy, spontaneous amnesia of the human animal. It's a kind, we forget how much of our past we remember, how much of our past we recollect. We are not able to completely recollect. We are not able to completely remember every moment of our life. So there is something called active forgetting, according to him, and uh, this is exactly the opposite of another thought put forward by Walter Benjamin. Terry Eagleton, in his essay Capitalism, Modernism, and Postmodernism, quotes these writers, wherein he quotes Walter Benjamin, and Walter Benjamin says this. He talks of a revolutionary nostalgia, that is, the power of active remembrance. This is totally opposed to the Nietzschean concept of active forgetting. Here, revolutionary nostalgia, that is, the power of active remembrance. And he calls this a ritual summoning and invocation of the tradition. So, somehow or other, he says we have to summon history to the present in order to understand history. So, there is another person, Lyota. I'll just quote a few people like this, what they have to say about modernism. Then we'll come back to this movement. So, now remember, Lyotard, he is deeply opposed to any such historical consciousness. He counteracts um, he counteracts to the position of Walter Benjamin, and he says um, uh, he is opposed to such historical consciousness and the reactionary celebration of narratives of eternal present. Okay, so he is opposed to historical consciousness as well as to the modernist way of celebrating narratives as eternal present. Well, whether you can forget past and you can focus only on present, which we call modern, and he says no, and he is against it. But there is one more person, that is Paul Deman. He argues that active forgetting can never be successful. He says the Nietzschean model of active forgetting, that is not possible. And also he says the distinctively modernist act which seeks to erase history or keep history under erasure cannot be totally successful. And he says this whole dream of, that is, modernism's a dream of self-origination. That is, it has no origin in history, it has no connection with the past, rather it is self-originatory or origin, its origins are in the present, and uh, its hunger for something like historically unmediated encounters with the real. Say, history has a way of coming back to mediate our present. So every time when we talk about our Indian independence or Indian democratic setup or way of life. We go back in time, we go back in history, and we go back and invoke history to define our present constitution, our present way of life. But he says this kind of historical mediation, right, has to be ruled over. So there is this hunger of modernism to have something like historically unmediated encounter with the real, and also it's internally fissured present. Okay. He claims, that is Paul Liman claims, to write is to disrupt a tradition. Every time you write, you are a modern. You disrupt the tradition. When Chaucer wrote, he was considered a modern writer in English. When Edmund Spenser wrote, he was considered a modern. When Shakespeare introduced something like a tragic comedy, he was regarded as a modern writer. So every time someone came up with a new narrative style or a new way of presentation, right, it was regarded as modern. When when a sonnet was written in 10.5 lines, what we call a cut-off sonnet, it was regarded as something modern, a modern way of writing sonnet, not in the traditional style of writing in 14 lines. So when you break free from one particular form of writing, it is always regarded as modern. And to write is to disrupt a tradition, and modernism is full of such disruptions. And he points out this. All literature for Liman, that is for Paul Liman, is a ruined or baffled modernism. I like this definition. All literature is a ruined or baffled modernism. And he says, every time a writer attempts at something, he tries to ruin the writing of the past. Okay. Then there is this person, his name is Perry Anderson. In his illuminating essay, Modernity and Revolution, he rejects the very designation modernism as completely lacking in positive content. So many people say or believe that modernism lacks in positive content because it is basically a kind of a decreation. Frank Kermode, he used the term decreation, and there is so much of negativity here, but he says there is what he calls plenty of positive things about modernism. So we will see how everything disrupted, how this disruption happened because of these movements. Now take a look at this concept of impressionism. I'm sure you are able to watch this on screen. The concept of impressionism, this began sometime in the 1870s. Now, what is exactly impressionism? We'll try and understand. That is, when we look at something, our mind collects what we call sensory data. It becomes conscious of that moment, of that present. And when our senses are alive, through our 5 senses, we realize the world. We understand the world. We come to an understanding of the world. And these impressions are sometimes long-lasting, and sometimes they are momentary. All the same, they are impressions. So impressionism is about, I'll show you a few pictures, perhaps you can understand what impressionism is all about. I'm going to jump by a few. Now, Look at this piece of painting. This was by a painter by name Claude Monet. Impression Sunrise. See, uh, if you take a look at this picture, you may come across colors. This is, you can see in the front there is a boat and there is another boat closely behind it. There seems to be a waterway and there is the sun rising. So the painter has captured what his mind has gathered. That particular moment. Say, this particular painting reminds me of my college days in Ayutthaya College of Arts and Science, Tiruchendur, where I was a hostler. Every morning, I would look out from my room and my eyes would espy this beautiful scenery where the sun would come out of the sea like a giant red ball. And I could see the boats, especially these old-fashioned boats, right? What we call sailing boats, coming towards the seashore. Even those impressions still linger on my mind. So, impression gathering. Now, look at the colors. I'm not going to discuss the choice of colors or the brush strokes of the painter. My concern is not that. If you want to learn more about Impressionist painting, you can go and read about the painters and how they carefully chose those colors of the canvas and how they didn't mix certain bright colors and how they used natural colors and so on. Right. Now, the Impressionist technique was used by writers as well in literature. And in literature, you would find writers using this kind of impressionistic technique. And when they use this technique, that is, they try to show this transitory mental impressions. They wrote down in their work these transitory mental impressions. Say, you come across a passage in James Joyce, either in his Ulysses or in his A Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, about the moo moo cow. So now the moo moo cow, the moment you come across a term like a moo moo cow, the sound that cattle made, the cow made, and it had left and it still rings in your ears. You are able to recapture that moment when you had seen a bellowing cow or the cow that rustled and moved. Everything is there on your mind to be reproduced. Okay, so let's go back. Likewise, the artists, they try to capture certain things. Now look at this. The second one is what we call expressionism. Now this artistic technique is also used in literature. Primarily, it was used in painting. Perhaps I would show you an expressionist painting. You'll be able to understand. Now, what is expressionism? See, there are emotions within us which just wait to be expressed. Now, if you cannot express them, perhaps you will go mad. And expressionism is all about presenting a world that is violently distorted, and it all depends on the pressure that builds within us and the personal mood in which a writer finds himself, and it could be based on an ideology or ideas, thoughts, emotions which represent the external reality. So now it's not an organized movement. It was an important factor in painting. I'll show you a piece of painting. There were great painters, but I'll show you one of these paintings. Perhaps you can understand expressionism. So now look at this piece of painting. This is by a Norwegian painter by name Edvard Munch. The title of the painting is The Scream. Many people regard this as one of the costliest paintings in the world, The Scream, where you want to give vent to all those suppressed feelings and emotions. It could be not only your emotions, your thoughts, your ideas, and your all those that have accumulated within you, right? The writer gives expression to that, and sometimes, when you find in a stream of consciousness technique, a character giving vent or giving expression to all her or his thoughts and feelings and emotions and so on. Okay, so they found that this expressionism in art had an impact on literature as well, and it found expression in many ways. Okay, so you come across other painters also like Van Gogh and many other paintings of Van Gogh, and also other writers and playwrights. You come across this one expressionist technique, which is also part of a modernist way of writing. But I'm keenly interested in uh, other forms, for example, like Dadaism. Now take a look at Dadaism. Now what is this movement called Dada? Now this was an early 20th century art movement which became very popular, and the members of this movement, they sought to ridicule the culture of that time, and I'll show you. And uh, how did they do it? They did it by deliberately absurd performances in poetry and visual art. Now, Andre Breton, he was a pioneer, and he was a pioneer in this anti-rationalist movement. See, for a long time, Enlightenment had its hold on people. The whole concept of rationality, using rationality to solve human problems, to understand our world, to understand fellow humans, to understand our very existence. But they ridiculed this, and this came generally out of the disillusionment of the world and the tradition of the world. Now, no one expected World War One to break out, and World War One taught humans many lessons. Okay, so now we'll look into a person like Andre Breton and others, and they firmly believed or they embraced the extraordinary, that is, the irrational, the unprecedented, and the incomprehensible. Now, irrational, unprecedented, and incomprehensible, because the world itself was like that. The World War One was that typical example. Okay, so it acquired a name and identity, Dadaism, somewhere in 1916. And even before that, there was this man called Marcel Duchamp. And Marcel Duchamp, he made this ready-made everyday objects. And he displayed these everyday objects as art pieces just to shock the people's sensibility. For instance, he displayed a bicycle wheel or even a bottle rack, and by displaying them as art pieces, he elevated them to the level of or to the status of sculpture, and he exhibited them in gallery. When people visited art gallery, especially in New York City in 1915, they were in for a shock, and they thought it was only a playful way of doing things. have no real value. Now look at this. This was a male urinal. He displayed it in New York as an art piece, and the title of this piece of sculpture, as we called it, it was made of porcelain. It was a porcelain ware, and at the bottom it was signed R. Mutt 1417. When this was displayed as an art piece, people had a shock. It looked very crude. At the same time, it challenged the traditional concept of our aesthetic sensibility. See, now, aesthetic sensibility, how they define aesthetic sensibility in the past, our appreciation of things beautiful. Now, take a look at something like this, a fountain or male urinal, or something like what we call a bicycle. Such early Dadaists, and within a year of its founding, that is in 1960, its Dada shifted. It shifted to Europe. They call that Cabaret Voltaire, and it lasted only for 5 months. This Cave Voltaire or Cabaret Voltaire, and within 5 months it dissolved. But Dadaism, it challenged the notion of bourgeois and bourgeois sense of aesthetics, right? And many such things. And the direct fallout of Dadaism was surrealism. I'll tell you something about surrealist thinking and surrealist way of thinking, for which you need to understand what surrealism exactly was. Now take a look at this picture. This is a painting by Salvador Dali, and it is titled Persistence of Memory. What did the surrealists do? What do we understand by surrealism? Now, it was an art movement as well as a literary movement, and it explored the realm of dreams and the unconscious mind. They owe a great deal to Sigmund Freud, and the unconscious mind, how it functions in the creation of visual art and poetry and also motion pictures. So it was officially launched in Paris in 1924, and the French writer André Breton, he wrote the first surrealist manifesto. Now, during this modernist period, you come across a series of manifestos. Earlier, I mentioned F.T. Marinetti's Futurist Manifesto. André Breton also wrote two surrealist manifestos, one in 1930, another one in 1942. It moved to other parts of Europe, and remember, it looks into juxtaposing the images. Now look at all the images. These images are from our concrete world. Like in our mind, these images, they just try to juxtapose in a painting. So you have something like a wall clock or like a table, all right? Then a barren tree and a mountain view at the back. There are so many things. So now there is a dream-like quality about this whole poem. Say, our memory surfaces in our dream, and when it surfaces in our dream, all those suppressed memories and things like that, when they surface or when they manifest themselves in a dream, they manifest in various manner. So look at this. The dream itself has something like an irrational quality. look at the painting. It doesn't seem to make any sense to us. It appears to be something irrational because we don't get any serious message. It doesn't tell you a story. It doesn't capture a moment in our human life. But rather, what is on our mind? It tries to say our mind is something layered densely and differently. Now, since our mind is layered densely and differently, all these objects of the world in the form of images, they can be located in our mind. So, when they find an expression, this is how they find that expression. And in our language, they find the expression differently. For example, there may be a slip of the tongue, right? Or there may be in an odd moment, we may use even a swear word or something like that. But going and delving deep into our unconscious and to bring out those things to the surface level, it calls for certain effort. Okay, so in a stream of consciousness technique, for instance, what is this stream of consciousness technique? This technique was first experimented by Dorothy Richardson in her work called Pilgrimage. The term stream of consciousness was coined by William James. I refer to William James, who had written a lot on unconscious mind. Now, what do you find in stream of consciousness technique? Like this, many things. It may be memories, they may be our fantasies, lived moments, right? Or it could be anything. They are all housed in our mind. And they find easy expression. In a stream of consciousness novel, they find easy expression through the character's mouth. Say, interior monologue is slightly different. There, it is used as a particular technique to reveal the mind of a character. But here, it is no holds barred expression. When I say no holds barred expression, there is no inhibition. There is nothing that suppresses or represses your mind. Instead, they all find a free expression. Okay, say, when Sigmund Freud discussed id and ego, id are our impulses. They are our impulses. Say, they are there. In the name of ego, in the name of culture, we try to suppress our real desires, which can be located in the unconscious part of our minds. Okay, in painting as well as in writing, you would find this kind of surrealist expression. Okay, I would like to show one more surrealist one. This is by Rene Magritte. This is one of those famous paintings, The Man with the Bowler Hat. I do not know how many of you have seen this film, The Thomas Crown Affair. It's a beautiful film, The Thomas Crown Affair. This is about an art dealer, how he steals a Monet painting. And in that film, this particular painting plays a very important role, also known as the Son of Man. Okay, so now focus your attention on what Tristan Tzara, right, the original founder of Dada movement. I told you he published certain manifestos and they are very popular. Okay, now we will move on to something like what we call imagist movement or imagism. which became very popular during this time. See, here I should be quoting someone like um, founded. Um, right. Okay. That's how he titled it. A few don'ts by an images. His dictum was make it new and make it new. That is, when you write poetry, make it new. So, what did the images do? See, they made the poem to be very sharp. They were greatly influenced by uh, poems like haiku, poetry of the Japanese, and they were influenced by Japanese poetry and other poets from the Eastern world. So I'll give you an example, perhaps you can understand. People like William Carlos Williams, Hilda Doolittle, Amy Lowell, they were all members of this group called Images Movement. See, the image is something transitory, something that is there for a while and it disappears. So now, like almost like the Impressionists, but slightly different in the sense when a poet tries to capture this image. Okay, now William Carlos Williams, when he wrote his The Red-Wheeled Barrow, it's a very short poem. In that poem, he says, so much depends on a red-wheeled barrow glazed with rainwater besides the white chicken. Now, this is a piece of poem. So much depends on a red-wheeled barrow glazed with rainwater besides the white chickens. Now, it just brings to our mind's eye many things. Now, what are the things it brings to our mind's eye? A red-wheeled barrow, which is usually full of dust. Now, today it is clean, glazed with rainwater. All the dirt and grime are washed away, and it has even acquired a sheen, and it is red in color. It's in the center of a garden. You can understand the rest of the garden is green. So the image of green comes to your mind without even prompting, and two white chicken standing next to the red-wheeled barrow. A beautiful image is created in our mind. So the images try to capture that moment, that particular moment, that transitory moment, using or writing about all those images which appeal to our five senses. Okay, so according to Marjorie Turlough, this was an important moment, along with the war poets and others who crowded the literary scene during the period of war. Apart from that, I want to tell you about this coexistence of two modernities. I think I started with that. That is modernity of technology and social life, and aesthetic modernity. Modernity of technology and social life and aesthetic modernity. And for modernist worldview, say, we regard that as some kind of a nihilism or authoritarianism, that worldview. And when writers, especially these three great modernist writers, the time is very short, I would like to focus on these three great modern writers. One is James Joyce, the other person is T.S. Eliot, the third person is Virginia Woolf. Now, what do they have to say? Now, T.S. Eliot, when he wrote his essay, Ulysses, Order and Myth, this was published in 1923, Ulysses, Order and Myth. So, where he has argued the development of ethnology and psychology, and also he makes a reference to Sir James Fraser's The Golden Bough. Now, he talks about how myth has replaced the traditional narrative method, and he calls this the mythical method. So, in fact, he says the mythical method was first used by W.B. Yeats. See, Yeats employs various myths, including in his Leda and the Swan. He makes a reference to Greek mythology. In an earlier lecture, I told you, I discussed this poem, Leda and the Swan, how Zeus came in the form of a swan and he seduced, right, her, and the daughter of Leda is no one else but Helen. Okay, you know the story. And what is this mythical method according to T.S. Eliot? That is, in such a style of writing, you will find plenty of allusions to the past, to the antiquity. See, you will find antiquity and contemporaneity getting juxtaposed. Look at his own poem, T.S. Eliot's Wasteland. You find a reference to River Thames in the work of Edmund Spenser's Proclamion, how that River Thames, the classical one, which runs sweetly, which flows sweetly without any modern day pollution. But look at the River Thames, which he refers to. It is full of detritus of modern life. Okay, so he makes a reference to the old text and the modern text, and it is full of allusions. Of course, it is fragmentation. Now, this fragmentariness or fragmenting the images, even in a piece of poem, that could be called modernist. It is not, when you take a look at T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, it doesn't appear or sound like a traditional poem. It looks like a collage of images, a collection of fragments, and they in turn allude to many things which are related to myths and stories from the past. Okay, so and he calls this modern stylistics as something like mythical method. That is one. If you happen to read James Joyce Ulysses, it just sounds like a toilet reverie, right? Whether it is Molly Bloom or the central character, right? A Jewish character in Catholic Dublin, you come across in that work. And what you come across, it is full of disjointed. See, when it comes to grammar, when it comes to syntax, all this traditional way of arranging sentences or framing sentences, they are done away with. And the traditional mode of storytelling, where you have beginning and an end. Everything is reversed. It is nothing but a collection of ideas from the beginning and the middle and the end, and they are all jumbled. Okay, so and it is again full of memories, full of thoughts from the depths of your mind. Okay, now in the case of Virginia Woolf, well, she has written many pieces of literature in a room of one's own. You know, it sounds like a feminist manifesto. Look at the many manifestos that came during this period. This is a feminist manifesto. We know that. I'm not going into a room of one's own. She wrote many novels like The Ways to the Lighthouse and so on. Now, all these works you would find a very conscious way of a character telling a own story, which is something like interior monologue. She uses the term interior monologue. Now, these three writers came to be known as high modernists because they completely altered the mode of writing, the way of telling, and above all, the narrative structure, the traditional narrative structure stands collapsed. And it is not only collapse of plot, and it's a replacement by what we call intertextual allusion, but the stream of thought that we come across in this work. Okay, so now before I conclude, I want to focus some of these key points related to modernism. I will tell you one by one, perhaps you can take down. Say, if there is atonalism in music and anti-representationalism in painting, or what we call free verse in poetry, or fragmentation and stream of consciousness in novel, they continued well into the next few decades. So, as I pointed out earlier, Frank Kermode calls this as technical introversion. He calls this technical introversion or a sort of decreation. He talks about the two kinds of modernism. One he calls paleo-modernism, that original old one, and neo-modernism, right? And modern art require these two distinction of paleo-modernism and neo-modernism for our understanding, according to him. Okay, so but different people had a different concept. I told you about the Ashish Nandi, who talked about colonialism, which he called the armed version of modernism. And certainly, modernism meant many things for many people. Uh, but I would like to point out some of these key concepts of modernism before I close. Now, modernist literature depicts modern life, especially urban life, and what you find is nothing but an ambivalence towards this urban life. Okay, then what do you see around the when we say ambivalence? You find a cult of ugliness, thanks to the invasion of machinery, thanks to the invasion of factories, thanks to the invasion of all these industries. There is a cult of ugliness about that. This is one way of looking at it. Then, modernist text makes a wide and unexpected range of reference to myth and other things. So, it is verbally ambiguous and paradoxical. Now, remember, it is Claire Brooks who talks about language of paradox. Poetry itself school of criticism. Lemon squeezer school of criticism. But so they examine only the linguistic part of any writing. Okay. The third poems like Proclamion and T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, the chaotic present and orderly past. Then modernism suggests that art can transcend the disorder of the present. Now, art is certainly superior to nature. Nature is so messy, inherently messy, whereas art is orderly. Even what seems to be a disorder in a piece of writing, there is some kind of orderliness. Right. Then the next one is it has been argued that modernist literature possesses a spatial form. That is, the time is always mentioned as eternally present in a modernist writing. There is no reference to a particular time in history or in the past. It is always eternally present, but it goes on to create what we call a spatial form, which is advocated by Foucault at a later stage. And the next one is this mythical patterning, which I discussed a few moments ago, and a mythical allusion. And this mythical allusion or mythical patterning as an organizing principle or organizing structure in a piece of writing. So, in a way, there is a parallel between contemporaneity and antiquity. Okay. Then you find in modernist literature there is a regression to the past, that is to the primitive state. That the primitive state as a point of reference. Take for instance the works by D.H. Lawrence. But he also lived during this time when he wrote his Rainbow or Women in Love and Lady Chatterley's Lover. You find the primitive self, the carnal self that is within a human, which tries to come to terms with the educated self. The primitive self, the carnal self, and the educated self. His poem Snake is a classic example. Right? His educated self tells him to go and kill the snake, whereas the primitive self tells him, look, it also belongs to the world that you inhabit. Okay. And you have no right to kill it. And you have no right to ill-treat it because it is also your fellow organism which shares the space in this planet. Okay. Now, I'm not going into that. Now, the primitive self, you read something like Heart of Darkness and the whole novella, you will find when the Europeans, when they travel to Africa, they identify themselves easily with the natives and the European themselves going native in their midst. Very interesting. You go and read these novels and poems that are written during this particular age. Then modernist literature displays an awareness of the complexity of the mind and the self. Complexity of the mind. That's what phenomenology talks about. The human consciousness, the complexity of the mind. That's what Sigmund Freud explained in his talks and in his readings and in his book. And how humans have to become aware of the fluidity of consciousness and the force of the unconscious in our everyday life. And also this division or distinction between our social self and the personal self. The personal self we alone know, and the social self is something like a facade or something like a mask that we wear before others. Okay, so then finally, in a modernist text found as an imagist, he talks about his fear of abstractions, his fear of abstraction. Rather, he strongly advocated, he left images movement and started something like Vorticism or along with Wyndham Lewis. Now, Wyndham Lewis, he started Vorticism, which is simply blasted every blast. And in this blast, review of the great English vortex, he advocated this idea of vorticist manifesto. Now go and read these different manifestos. There were plethora of manifestos. There were plenty. And vorticism or vorticist group, it blasted various people and institutions, including England, right? And it advocated a strong break from our traditional concept of such societies. And this movement, it gained notoriety later, and many people thought the vorticist movement um, was less frenetic and dynamic than what we call a Dadaist movement, and slowly it also lost its steam. Uh, perhaps it was the first avant-garde movement. There are so many avant-garde movements that were popular during this time, and if you look at them, you would come to this understanding that all these movements shaped our thinking, and even they developed a philosophy. Existentialism was the philosophy of this time. It had its origin during this time. Existentialist philosophy, especially its absurdist and nihilist form of existentialist thought, which made our world completely without any meaning. For most of the existentialist philosophers, the world had no meaning. It was all absurd. Now, what they regarded as absurd belonged to the past and also to the present, especially something like World War One. And this philosophy had its roots in this particular time and in this particular period, which we choose to describe as modernism. But remember, modernism has its own continuity. After after the First and the Second World War, it came to be identified with postmodernism. Now, postmodernism is not complete break from modernism. In a way, many of these modernist thoughts and ideas, they make a comeback through postmodernism. And in a way, postmodernism is a continuous uh, reassessment of modernist beliefs, a continuous reassessment of uh, literary modernism, you will learn more. So what I have tried to say in this 1.5 hours is something very postmodernism in the days to, in the weeks to come. Thank you. Now you can ask me